So thanks for joining us for the National Survivor Network's weekly skill building session on active and reflective listening. I'm Chris Ash, and I am the Survivor Leadership Program Manager at CAST, where a big part of my role is managing the National Survivor Network. Before we dive into this, one of the things that I want to remind everybody is this is not a comprehensive training. No one's going to leave this prepared to, start facilitating support groups or doing crisis intervention or hotline work. But this is just to highlight some of the skills that are out there that can be really beneficial in some of the roles we fill. I find in the movement a lot of times trafficking survivors are thrown into situations where they're expected to be peer mentors or do crisis work or lead support groups without ever getting preparation. And so on the one hand, we're incredibly resourceful. We usually do a good job. We learn the things we need to learn. And the flip side of that is even survivors of trauma benefit from training and professional development if we're going to be doing direct work with people who are still in active trauma. And that includes people who are still being trafficked, recently trafficked, or maybe they were experiencing trauma a long time ago, but they're having sort of this internal crisis that's come up for them, this sensation of internal crisis. If you're going to be doing that kind of work, you really will benefit from some training in professional development. These skills that we're going to touch on today, we're just going to do a superficial highlights reel of what's out there, but active listening, reflective listening, facilitation, crisis response, these are all things that you can do many, many days of in-depth study. People do years of in-depth study to build out their skills. There's a lot of training out there for you to go and continue building on your expertise. This training is not meant to be a replacement for that thorough preparation. It's just sort of giving you some ideas about skills you might be able to use. And if you're going to be doing this work regularly, definitely seek out adequate preparation and training on a variety of skills and topics, including suicidality and how to assess that kind of crisis, because these are important skills for us to have. If you are working for an organization, it is absolutely reasonable to expect that they might pay for you to get the professional development and training that you will need to build your skills to do the work you're being asked to do, because it's unethical for organizations to put people into the position of working with people who are in active trauma, including those moments when they're re-traumatized, by sharing details or doing some of the healing parts. Some of that healing work can be really triggering. And it's unethical to put people into the position of working in those roles without adequate preparation or protocols. So with that said, as survivors, we often fill different roles. We're a friend, we're a mentor, we may do crisis support, we may be a support group facilitator, we might supervise other staff or volunteers. We're also co-workers in these peer-colleague relationships, and we may be employees where we work for someone, and some of us are parents as well. And each of these roles has different norms around how we communicate and requires a little bit of a different approach. Sometimes we get those roles confused. I don't know if you have friends who are social workers, but sometimes I have friends who are social workers who shift into that really balanced facilitation, active listening piece, and they even use the social work voice. And I find myself telling them, don't social work me right now. You're a friend. I want you mad with me, right? And also, you don't use the same approach that you might use with a friend that you do with someone you're mentoring or that you're doing crisis support with. If I have a friend who's upset at a romantic partner, friends might say something silly like, that's it, he's out, let's go, we're going to go take care of this, and start like joking about going and, we're getting rid of him. This is it. We're going to go tell him what's what. That may not be the most appropriate way to respond to people in these other roles, these other kinds of relationships with you. So one of the things we find that can be hard for survivors who've never had that kind of preparation, and we talked about this in our earlier skill building session on professional boundaries, sometimes it's hard to know how to enter into some of these other roles when we're used to being in that friend role. right? We're used to saying what we think. We're used to the idea of validation, meaning I agree with you, I'm on your side. Sometimes validation can mean I hear your feelings and they're totally valid feelings. I understand how you feel this way. And also, let's talk about what some of your options are, right? There's a difference between being heard and being understood and being agreed with, right? And sometimes we, in our roles, our role isn't to tell someone what to do or to automatically agree with what they say. Our role may be to work with them, right? And this is where these active and reflective listening skills come in handy, is when we're in these roles in particular. We can still use active and reflective listening in other relationships. When you learn these skills and you practice them, you'll get better at knowing when you might need them in other relationships, but they're essential in our peer support relationships. So a key part of being a mentor or crisis support person or a facilitator is that you're there to help the other person clarify what they're feeling and what they think might help them. You're there to help them think through their options for solutions, to think through and talk about and share what they're feeling, to identify what they're feeling. Many of us who've been through trauma have moments when we're like, I don't feel right, but I can't put my finger on what the feeling is. There's a feeling under the surface, right? When we're in these roles, it is not about what you think they should be feeling or what you would be feeling if you're in their position. That's something that gets confused a lot in peer support, where people don't have adequate preparation, is sometimes we might make the mistake of assuming someone else has the same feelings we would have in their situation or about their situation. It's also not about what you think would help them, right? You will have thoughts about what you think would help them. That's not the part we're talking about. It's a normal human thing to be connecting and to be thinking, oh, here's how I would be feeling. Here's what would help me. But if everything you have to say is about what you would do, then you're missing that individual's unique perspectives and feelings and experiences. And that can make you less effective as a mentor or a crisis support or a facilitator. An example of that is I've taken hotline calls where I really felt in my heart that someone needed medical attention. And I wanted to say, go to the doctor right now, go to the hospital now, but I couldn't say that because that's not my role. That doesn't mean you ignore things that are concerning. It means that you still give them the agency. So in that example, what I said on that hotline call was, I keep hearing you mention some symptoms that are kind of concerning. Have you considered going to the hospital? Right? That's again, honoring their agency, respecting their choice while not ignoring things that concern you. Because when you're in those roles, ultimately, we are there to help them figure out their feelings and their needs. Because part of complex trauma, it takes away our ability to tell what we're feeling, because we have to dissociate and disconnect from our feelings in order to survive tough times. It takes our ability to tell what we need because there's someone else constantly telling you what you need or dismissing you when you say what you do need, telling you your feelings don't matter or that your feelings are wrong, right? That's a big part of those abusive dynamics. And so we end up losing sometimes our ability to identify our feelings and where they're coming from and what we want to do with them and what we need to have in our lives. So because trafficking takes away and denies people's ability to have their own feelings, to connect with their own feelings and to know what they need, we can't repair the harm of trafficking by repeating it through the way we support somebody. We are not restoring someone's agency if we're making our feelings about their situation more important than theirs. Or if we're telling someone they don't know what they need. I know you're telling me this is what you need and this is the solution you want, but you're wrong, right? Because they've experienced that before as part of their abuse. So if we want to truly repair the harm of trafficking, that means we respect and restore that person's agency, even when the choices that they're wanting to make and the way they're understanding their feelings is different from us, right? So a good support person is going to listen to the feelings and help the person identify what they're feeling. without seeming scared of the person's feelings. That's a big thing. Have you ever like started to reveal some of the big feelings that you may have to someone, and you can see by their face and their body language that they're sort of withdrawing and a little bit overwhelmed and not sure what to do with you or your story, right? So a good support person listens without seeming scared of their feelings and validates the feelings. We can validate feelings even if we think that maybe their interpretation of why they're having the feelings could be off, or even if we think their assessment of the facts in front of them may be a little different. We can understand the feelings, right? That can include if someone has really complicated feelings about their trafficker. We're not going to fix that by saying that you don't love them, right? What we're going to say is, yeah, I can see how that's really hard to know that someone you care this much about really caused you this kind of harm and took away your choice, right? Like we can validate those feelings, whether or not they make sense. A good support person is going to give lots of time and space for the feelings before moving into problem solving. And then when you problem solve, you're going to help the person figure out what they need instead of telling them what you think they need or what you did or what you would do. Just want to name that listening and holding space for people's difficult feelings is one of the most tender and precious gifts that we can give anyone, but especially survivors of complex trauma. Because a lot of us have been told that we're too big, that we are too much, that we are too traumatized, that our feelings are too frightening. And that then means that we don't have that many spaces where we can like disclose some of these feelings and share about them. And what that means is, since we don't have those spaces where we can share them, they end up bubbling up in places we didn't mean to. We end up speaking on a panel and finding ourselves sharing our deepest feelings and frightening feelings and big traumas, or we end up in a work meeting getting triggered and overwhelmed and not knowing how to respond and blowing up at someone. So having safer and braver and emergent spaces where we can have our feelings heard and held is super important for our for our healing. So one of the skills you'll use while giving someone space to talk about their feelings before moving into any kind of problem solving or solutions is reflecting back the feelings. You might find yourself helping the person draw out the feeling that they're feeling instead of just directly paraphrasing. They may not always know what the feeling underneath is, so you listen. You may hear them talk about something that they did not do because the consequences would have been really big or harmful. And that might be fear that you're hearing. I'm hearing you say you felt really scared and unsupported. Is that right? Or you might say something like, what I'm hearing you say is that when they did that, you worried that there was nobody you could trust. That must have felt really lonely. And see if you got that right. Or that sounds painful. I'm hearing that you might have felt trapped. And you notice how with each of those, there's either a tentative piece, like an it sounds like, or what I'm hearing you say is, or it has that question tone, like you might have felt trapped. Because what we want to do is give someone the opportunity to let us know if we're on the right track. Because sometimes you might not be, right? Sometimes they might say, it's not quite that. I think what it really was, right? Or they may be like, exactly, that's exactly it. I did feel trapped. I hadn't thought of it that way, but trapped, that's a good word for that, right? So we want to be reflecting back the feelings. And it can feel awkward when you've not practiced this, because sometimes you may have a fear that you're going to reflect back the feelings and that that's not asking a question, that they're not going to say anything. But I promise you, if you reflect back the feelings and then you pause, don't be afraid of silence. Sometimes when I do trainings and I ask a question and people aren't engaging, I always joke, I did hotline work for a decade. I am really comfortable sitting here until someone feels like there's something to say. When you're doing that crisis work, there's often really long, uncomfortably long for you, periods of silence where you're giving that person time to sort of integrate what the conversation is, what they're feeling, whether or not we're on the right track. Almost always, if you say something like, that sounds so painful and like you might have felt trapped, they're not going to just stop talking and go, yep, a lot of times they might be like, yeah, and what made it really hard, right? So those are things you can say that because they're tentative, they're acknowledging the feelings, they're not rushing someone, they can often open the door for the conversation to continue. It gets tricky sometimes because some of us may have a hard time sometimes identifying our own feelings. So there's a tool that I'd love to share with you called the Feelings Wheel by Dr. Gloria Wilcox. And what we do is we start in the middle with these main feelings that we may be feeling: sad, mad, scared, joyful, powerful, peaceful. And you start to follow them out, and you may see that under scared, maybe scared is showing up as confused or rejected, helpless, submissive, insecure, anxious. If we break those down, you may start to see that they're overwhelmed, or maybe the insecurity is coming from being embarrassed that we don't know everything. Maybe the helplessness is coming from worrying that we're insignificant to people who we care about, right? This feelings wheel, there's a lot of different feelings lists and frameworks out there, but sometimes if you're going to be doing some sort of peer support crisis work, especially if it's over the phone or somewhere you can have notes around you, sometimes having that feelings wheel around is a good thing to help you kind of see if you're picking up on the right feeling and trace it through to where it might be coming from. Sometimes people may actually be on the outer rung of this wheel. They may be feeling insignificant and unaware of how that might be tied to a fear or to feeling scared, right? So these little pieces of the wheel, the colors, can kind of help us put together some connections with people. Another tool that you may want to consider, and you can find this online as well, the basic reflective listening formula. This starts with a tentative opening, and then you suggest the feeling and the about, because, or when, and then you can follow it up with a question. Is that right? So you might say, if I'm following you, it seems like you feel sad about that relationship, falling apart. And someone can then say, yeah, that's it. And then they'll usually say, and then, and share more. Or you could say, I think I hear you saying you felt alone when nobody helped you while you were struggling to get access to resources, right? They can then follow up with you. Or it sounds like, or it seems like you felt ashamed because your mother blamed you for what happened when you were trafficked, right? This is sort of like the tentative formula that we use. You're keeping it tentative because you don't want to say, you're sad, and then just leave it at that. We want to make sure that we're letting them know we might be wrong, but this is what I'm hearing. Did I get that right? And sometimes through the process of shaping what you said, correcting you, validating you, they'll start to have their own connections about what the feelings are. Be aware of body language. So things like if you're leaning back or if you're consistently looking away while you're listening to someone, those may convey, I mean, they can come from a lot of different places, but sometimes people might perceive that as distance or disinterest. Be aware that you can do things while they're talking, like nodding and making sounds that show you're following and still there. That's especially important if you're on a phone where someone can't see you. Because doing hotline work, sometimes people would be like, are you still there? And have that little moment of like, did I just spill my life story for 5 minutes straight into a disconnected call? So, if you're in person, you can nod to show that you're listening and hearing it, right? Yeah, oh yeah. Like you can show ways of acknowledging that you're following. Your facial expressions, be conscious of. Some of us, myself included, do not have the most innate filters to what our faces are revealing in any moment. But be aware that if someone says something really alarming and you look, or something big that they're feeling, something heavy that happened to them, and you immediately have a face of absolute shock. Sometimes they may read that as a face of disgust, or like something they said was wrong, or like they said too much. Also be thoughtful about your tone of voice. And I'll say tone of voice is good to be conscious of, like what people might perceive as sounding judgmental, but also if you have someone who's dysregulated, you can sort of start building in a bit more regulation and set the pace of the conversation with your tone of voice and your pacing. You'll want to be thoughtful about avoidable distractions. We know that not all distractions are avoidable, but trying to procure a distraction-free space can be a sign of saying, I'm here to listen. And then thinking about things like your position in the room. You're probably not going to have the best heartfelt conversation if you're sitting behind a desk and someone's sitting in a chair across the room from you, right? You might want to leave from behind your desk and go have a seat at a chair nearby, facing them, that kind of thing. Remember that as you reflect back what you're hearing, you can always ask check-in questions. This invites them to shape what you've said or correct you. Did I get that right? Is there anything I missed? Anything else that you wanted to share about that? Invite them into the dialogue. You're going to want to remember trauma is in the body, right? We've talked about how it's a physiological response to where your body starts producing the same physiological responses and chemicals that it does while you're actively in an unsafe situation. And that means that when people are talking about traumatic experiences, their body may start to have the exact same crisis response that they had in the body when something happened before. This means we need to think broadly. I've found a lot of people in the anti-trafficking movement think of crisis response as securing immediate needs, but may forget that sometimes you could still need crisis intervention years after having been trafficked. You could be doing very, very well and then just have an overwhelming week where something's in the news that's kind of really weighing heavy on you, and you're having family and personal issues going on, and you start talking about the situation, and for some reason your body starts releasing all those fight or flight chemicals into your system, and your body is in active crisis, even if you're not currently in an unsafe situation. So that means we can even use these crisis intervention, active listening, facilitation kind of skills, reflective listening, because they might get dysregulated or dissociated. And someone who's dysregulated or dissociated cannot be thinking through their options and solutions while they're that dysregulated. All of us that have been in really unsafe situations like trafficking, we know that while you're that dysregulated, it is hard to think through your options. And it's important to remember that even when someone's not in an actively unsafe situation, if they're getting dysregulated while talking about things, they're not in a space to think through options. So that is not the time to troubleshoot. And that is also why we don't want to rush past the feelings. We want to give plenty of time for some of those feelings to bubble up and to come out and to be kind of named and put out there so that the person can get to a little more of a place of feeling grounded before we talk about solutions. Sometimes if we rush past the feelings and go into problem solving, they may get unintentional messages that maybe don't reflect what we actually think or feel, but they may feel like this person does not understand how hard this is for me. They would not be moving on that fast if they realized what a big thing this is. They do not understand my feelings. They may be like, oh, I'm making this person uncomfortable talking about my feelings. They're trying to get me to stop talking about feelings. Got it. Don't share feelings that make other people uncomfortable. They might worry that their feelings are too much, or to think my feelings are so scary, they're even scaring other people. Or they might think this person moved on. Maybe my feelings are silly. Maybe I shouldn't be upset about this. They seem like they're moving on past that pretty quickly, right? So we want to be very thoughtful to move at their pace, and let them be the one who kind of like shares, and we just create the safer space for them to share that through showing that we're listening, that we're here, that we're reflecting back, and we're getting what they're saying. So how do we notice? I think a lot of us are pretty good at telling when someone's dysregulated. If you start to pay attention, you will notice that a lot of times when you watch presenters, especially survivor leaders who are speaking, I can almost mark the exact second that someone gets dysregulated while they're speaking. You can see it happen because telling our stories a lot, if that's the kind of leadership someone engages in, they may get dysregulated. You may notice that they shift and start to sound dissociated, and there's a flat affect, right? They start to tell it as if they're telling someone else's story, like with that flat way of talking. They might also alternatively start talking super fast because they're overwhelmed and it's just all coming out, right? Everything's just coming out so fast and I can't, and you might want to be like, hey, let's slow the pace just a little, right? They are dysregulated. I've been on hotline calls and in-person support sessions with people who started sobbing so intensely that I can't make out the words that they're saying. You may notice their breathing changes. Maybe their voice isn't changing as much, but you see that they're breathing a little faster, shorter, quicker breaths, right? You'll start to notice. Or maybe they start talking about solutions, but the way they're talking about it feels all over the place. You're like, whoa, I can't keep up with all the solutions and the way they're talking about it. Those are all signs they might be dysregulated. And if someone becomes dysregulated to a pretty intense level while you're talking to them, that can be scary, right? And sometimes we try so hard to, we don't want to stop the person or say something in a way that makes them feel like the feelings they're having are not okay. But if someone's trying to tell you things and you're having trouble hearing it, it can build trust to be honest about that. In a compassionate way. I'm not going to say, I can't hear what you're saying, stop sobbing. I'm going to say, hey, name. And often I'll say their name so that I can connect with them and make sure I have their attention. Hey, name, let's just take a moment, right? You want to take a minute? I really want to understand what you're saying because it's super important, but I'm having a hard time making it out right now. Do you want to take a minute and just kind of like regroup? You don't have to keep talking. We can take a moment. You've got this. I'm here. Right? You can also say, hey, name, it's okay if you need to take a moment to take care of yourself. I'm not going anywhere. If you need to take a minute to get yourself feeling a little more grounded, I'm still going to be here. I can wait. Right? And then follow your organization's protocols for any safety planning. You're going to want to stay with the feelings using reflective and active listening until they are ready to move on into solutions. And so how do we know when they're ready to move on? They may just tell you. They may just say, so that's what's going on, and I really need to be thinking about what I can do now. Another way you can tell is they may start to sound calmer than they did earlier in the conversation or more present. Another way you can ask. So don't be afraid of silence. Don't feel like you have to fill every pause, but leave a pause. And if there's a pause that goes on a while and they don't come back in and you're kind of getting the feeling that they might be ready to move on, you can say, that all sounds pretty hard. I do know, I heard you earlier, you mentioned some of the options you'd thought about. Were you wanting to talk about some of those? Or you can ask, do you feel heard? Is there anything I'm not getting? Anything else you wanted to share? And if they're like, no, that's basically it, then you can say, well, I know you mentioned some solutions. And that's one thing I always like to do is go back. If they mentioned potential solutions, whether they were good ones or ones they didn't want to do or ones they didn't like, I kind of like starting them back at thinking about the ideas they might have. So going back and saying, you mentioned something earlier that sounds a little like a possible option. Did you want to chat about that? Sometimes they'll be grounded. They're clearly ready to move on. You'll move into starting to talk about solutions. You'll be having a really grounded conversation about solutions. You know what, let me pause. Sometimes they're actually going to start talking about solutions while they're still dysregulated. So if someone is still sort of all over the place and dysregulated and they start talking about what they want to do, you can kind of draw that out, the feelings again, right? So you can say things like, sounds like you're still feeling pretty unsure about some of these solutions, like you're feeling uncertain. Or you can name it. You could say out loud, again, name the thing. It sounds like the feelings are really hard to talk about, and it's easier for you to think about solutions. You can also offer a pause. You can say to them, hey, I'm noticing that the pace might be getting a little faster than feels safe for you. Is that right? Would it help if we took a moment for a few deep breaths to ground? Give them that space to stay with the feelings if they're moving out of it while still dysregulated. And again, here's where the slide I thought I was about to be on, follow their lead. So sometimes they're going to be grounded. They're going to move into solutions and options, and you're having a very grounded conversation about options. And the more they talk, they start to get dysregulated the longer they talk. This is a sign that it's time for you to shift back into reflecting feelings, right? So remember, you can loop back into the feeling space to allow room for feelings periodically, even once you've moved into solutions. We can go back and reflect feelings for a while. And you can tie that to the solutions that they had so that it doesn't sound like you're just changing the subject, right? If they're like, and here's the option, but I can't do that because blah, 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 and my mom would know, and yada, yada, you can be like, wow, it sounds like it's kind of scary. It sounds like you might be feeling scared about people finding out. Is that right? And you're still staying in the conversation and not being formulaic, but you're noticing they're back talking about feelings and you're following them there. So solutions, how do we talk about solutions with people? I almost didn't include this because it really should be its own training, but I also don't want to leave you hanging. So we're going to do a couple of quick slides about doing solutions ethically and in a way that honors agency. Remember, your role is not to tell them the solutions or to tell them that the solutions they're thinking of are bad ideas. You don't know their life, right? That's not your job anyway. Your role is to help them think through what outcomes they want, what solutions might get them to those outcomes, and how each of those solutions might feel. Because a lot of times they'll want an outcome. They may know the outcome. They may have a solution that'll get them to the outcome. But when you say, well, so how would it feel to do that? They may come back and be like, I can't, I'm just too scared, right? I can't do that solution, or here's my barrier. So just be aware that these are all pieces you'll want to include. What is the outcome you want? What might get you there? And then how does that feel? Because sometimes the barrier to to moving towards the outcome with the solution might not be a logistical barrier. Sometimes it's a feelings barrier. And then we can still take that seriously and think about options and alternatives with them. Some helpful phrases might include things like, well, what things have you considered that might help? Right? That's a way of like letting them know they're the expert in their own experience. Well, here's an option you mentioned. How does that option feel? You may want to ask what feels good about that option. And again, don't be like, what feels good about that option? We don't want it to sound judgmental. But you can say, I hear you. What are the parts about that option that draw you to it? You may ask them, is there anything about that option that doesn't feel right or wouldn't work? And then you want to maybe help them cope ahead or plan ahead. What do you think might happen if you did that option and then your mother found out anyway, if that had been their concern? And the solution to that may not be, well, therefore I can't do it. The solution might be, well, so what can we do to prepare for if that happens, to help you know that you can take care of yourself, right? How would you feel if that happened? How might we navigate that? Do you want to make a plan in advance for how you'll care for yourself if you end up seeing your abuser in court, for example? Have you seen your abuser since leaving? How's that going to feel when you're in the room? How can we make sure you feel supported? Is there anything you need for that to not feel as frightening? And remember, your tone of voice can convey judgment when you're asking questions. So remember, we're not grilling them. We're going to help them clarify, like, this is us brainstorming and collaboratively problem solving. Keep the pace steady and slow to reduce the likelihood that the questions will be overwhelming. We don't want to feel like we're cross-examining them or interrogating them. So we're going to go really slowly. And even while we're in solutions, we may still reflect some feelings in between using our reflections formula to make sure that it feels conversational and it's not like every single thing that comes out of your mouth is a question, right? That keeps it feeling interactive and conversational. And above all, remember, coercion, gaslighting, telling someone what to do. These are often defining elements of trafficking and other forms of trauma. Do not repeat these dynamics in the way you give support. We don't coerce people into doing the things we think that they should. We don't tell people that their feelings aren't real and they don't know what they're talking about. We don't tell someone what they have to do. We show that we're on their team, that our goal is restoring their agency through the way we treat them. We are modeling to them through the way we support them how they should expect to be treated by other people. And that's a sacred trust, right? Like that's a very sacred responsibility and role to hold, and we want to hold it thoughtfully. We're all human, right? None of us are robots. There's no active and reflective listening crisis intervention robot that always calculates the exact right answer. You're always going to have moments where you turn back and look at things that you've said to people you were supporting and were like, oh, that didn't go well, or I probably shouldn't have said that, or I wish I knew then what I know now about this situation or this dynamic. And we want to remember that we always want to be thoughtful about the way that we support people in reclaiming their agency, their own decision making, their own autonomy. Thank you so much for joining us for this session, and I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording.